What is up, Bengals fam? It's your boy Mike coming back at you with another Who Daily. I've got friend of the show, former guest John Sheeran on the channel, at John_Sheeran on Twitter. He's also a writer for Cincy Jungle and a co-host of the Bengals OBI show. Really awesome to be here, and if you follow me on Twitter, more than likely you've seen John because John's been on the show before. I interact with him on Twitter a lot. We talk Bengals all the time. Glad to have you on the show, John.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Mike.
Yeah, it's been awesome. It's been really fun. I've gone later into the season this year than I did last year. Last year it was really for me about covering how good I thought the Bengals were going to be based on what I saw the year before and kind of some of the moves they were making and how I was really excited about Joe Burrow's first full season as a starter, right? But now I'm getting into the dog days of the offseason, which all NFL content creators understand how fun that usually is. You looking for topics, looking for things to talk about, and with dudes running around in shorts, basically. There's not a whole lot going on, but there is something new, I think, specifically for the Bengals fan base, and that is the Bengals are good now, like legitimately good, like legitimately talked about as contenders and not a secondary conversation in those conversations when you see national sports media talking about this. How do you deal with that? How do we deal with that, John?
Yeah, it's definitely new territory for most Bengals fans. I have to think that for the subsection of Bengals fans who are also Ohio State fans, I feel like that's a good portion of the fan base. I feel like they're mostly used to it. Ohio State is one of the powerhouses of college football, and they're the subject of a lot of criticism and just general hate. And I say hate because, like, the only teams that get hated on, or they get, a lot of people trolling people on Twitter, are the teams that are relevant, that are in the discussions every single year, and who maintain relevancy because of how good they are. And I feel like at this point, Bengals fans have gone through a generation's worth of social media as, like you said, a secondary topic in the overall NFL discussion. They used to just be a team that was largely a joke, not because that they were always terrible, but because whenever they were decent, they always ended the season the same. They lost in the first round of the playoffs, and the agendas were easy for people to pull out, and there was just no real effort into it. Like, the Bengals were relevant because of how mediocre they ended up becoming even when they were good. But now the situation's changed. Now they have legitimate talent. They have legitimate stars who are more than just, the soft-spoken variety of like AJ Green and Geno Atkins. Their quarterback is anything but what Andy Dalton was, just as a quarterback and a person. And it's taken on a new life as a true contending team that can make noise in a really tough AFC conference for the better part of the next decade. And I think that scares a lot of opposing fans. And when people are scared and stuff like that, you try to discredit them. You try to tear them down, make them into less of what they are. And Bengals fans are experiencing this for the first time. Now they're not trying to build up a team that isn't being taken seriously. They're trying to, prop up this team that everyone knows is good, but it's now become even more sensitive because it feels like more objective information that the Bengals are good, but now they're receiving levels of hate and trolling that they haven't really been receiving before because of how good they are. And it's definitely a new transition for a lot of people.
That's funny. You mentioned the Ohio State fan aspect. I guess we got to lump in the Bearcats now, right? I mean, they're not winning national championships, but
there's a parallel, Mike. There's a parallel, and I feel like it's the UC fans like myself experienced this last year for the first time too, because UC was just this group of 5 teams, specifically football. Like basketball, they were pretty good back in the day, but they never experienced anything close to what they experienced in football last year. And in 2020 specifically, when they were first getting top talk as like a top 10 team in the playoff era, it was still a general disbelief that they weren't going to be good enough, or they weren't going to be given the respect from the committee to make the top 4. So it was still looked at as like, oh, UC's a nice underdog story. I hope they go the distance or whatever, because no one actually believed that any of the 4 playoff spots would be threatened by a group of 5 team. Fast forward a year, UC remains undefeated. They beat Notre Dame. They continue to survive against a pretty weak schedule, and they don't really look dominant. but they keep rising in the rankings, right? And that's when people started to discredit UC for saying this team is not actually that good. There's no way they're one of the 4 best teams in the country, even though they've been undefeated for basically 2 years. They started the year in the top 10. They've done nothing but win. So now you have a bunch of Power 5 elitists who are trying to discredit UC for the first time, and then UC fans are like, hey, didn't you guys just love us? Weren't you guys rooting for us to shake up the dynamic of college football? Now you're just hating on us. And it basically became the same thing as the Bengals, because the Bengals were looked at as this underdog that wasn't really expected to do anything, and all of a sudden they're beating the Chiefs to win the division. They're barely survived in the playoffs, and then they make the freaking Super Bowl, and it's all of a sudden like they're no longer this innocent bystander of an underdog. They're an actual threat, and when you receive a new threat to the playing field, you try to discredit them.
Yeah, underdogs are cute until they grow up and bite you in the ass, right?
Exactly.
What? Did we just become best friends? Yep.
And I like what you said about the vibe. It just seems like the vibes of this team are noticeably different. I remember living through like the Andy Dalton, AJ Green, Geno Atkins years. There were some teams in that run that were way more talented, a way better roster. Maybe not. You could compare position groups and say, well, this is better than this and that kind of thing. But comparing, like, say, the 2015 roster, which I think, for my money, may be the best roster the Bengals have ever put onto the field. Like, that roster was dumb, but the vibe was always almost tacit acceptance of being the underdog, instead of what Joe Burrow and the boys are doing now, and that's saying, no, we're not the underdog. We're better than you, and we're going to go out there and show you. It's just a different mindset. It's weird. I think that's what Bengals fans are starting to get used to. And you brought up with the agenda. Like you mentioned the word agenda with the national sports media. And I'm kind of on the side. I'm a political junkie. I don't talk about that on the channel for obvious reasons. Everybody's better off for that. But an agenda to me, they're made up of talking points by and large. And I think what happened was there was like a set, almost etched in stone version of Bengals talking points that these guys have been talking about for years and years. It's not really ever changed. They've never actually really become, shook that underdog talking point off of them, and it's just too easy for guys like Keyshawn Johnson last week, or like I made a video last week about that, or any of these people who they don't go and watch the film. They're like, oh, they got some new offensive linemen, big deal. But the thing is, that is a huge deal, and it may be the key that actually unlocks this offense. And like the analysis just isn't in depth. It's too easy for them to fall back on their talking points, and it's kind of what I see is like, oh, you can almost, as somebody who's exclusively talks about the Bengals, you can always see when a national reporter has or has not actually looked at what the team is trying to do, has done, and is building toward, right? So I think that's one thing to keep in mind for fans. It's just like, sometimes you just got to be arrogant about it and say, I know my team better than you do. You know what I mean? I think that's kind of part of it. But are you telling me, John, that when I see people online just slinging hate at the Bengals, that's actually a good thing?
So in my mind, there's two types of agendas, and you definitely covered one perfectly to me, like the media agenda, or at least for like from a national sense. Like, and we talked about this last week in our conversation. It is really tough for a national analyst to cover all 32 teams. And I would definitely, if I was doing it, I would definitely try to find ways of maximizing my efficiency to make sure that I appropriately cover every single team. But there are definitely going to be some shortcuts that I would want to use to make sure that I get my work done and in a concise manner, because people's attention spans are also, pretty short. So with the Bengals right now, I think there's still overall an agenda about who they once were, and maybe they haven't quite proven themselves to be this next level of contender that they're starting to be. And that's just up to the Bengals to continue proving themselves along that path, so that the agenda eventually does change. Like, the Bengals aren't necessarily established as this dominant team because there's only been one real year of real success, 1 year where they won a playoff game in the last 3 decades. So those agendas, for the most part, have maintained, especially from the fact that they were basically never on primetime last year up until the playoffs. And that's when you started to see people actually watch the Bengals and take them seriously for once. So naturally, the better that they are, or the more consistent they are, the more often in the spotlight they will become. But as for what you were talking about, like on social media, those agendas are definitely less serious, and it's just really just fans, Chargers fans, Dolphins fans. You've seen some of this Herbert versus Tua stuff, where Dolphins fans are very much in their feelings for Tua, and they're trying to discredit Herbert, just like Chargers fans are really adamant about propping up Herbert as this top 3 or maybe even top 2 quarterback in the NFL, because that's their agenda, that's their guy. They want to support their guy by any means necessary. The rationale and the logic is thrown out of the window, and it makes for very useless conversations. And when the Bengals are thrown into those discussions by opposing fans, we've seen a lot of stuff from the Ravens in recent weeks about the Ravens and Bengals newfound rivalry, or just how that dynamic has really changed ever since Burrow has gotten here. It's a lot of feelings, right? It's a lot of people really trying to defend and prop up their guys at the sake of tearing down other guys. And when you see that happen to your team, when you see a bunch of hate and criticism and people really overanalyzing just how good or maybe not good some of your players or your team is, that really is a sign that, yeah, they're being taken seriously. There's a lot more attention on them now. People are actually starting to, take them seriously and take notice of them, but it's still not going to be them giving or them receiving the credit that they deserve, because there's still agendas on the table for those fans and whatnot, and they will never really back down from just supporting their teams at all costs. And that sometimes that comes at the cost of tearing down other teams.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at the way I see it, I think about actually Gonzaga, the college men's basketball team. They somehow are always a 1 or 2 loss team at the end of the year because they play in a bad conference, but then they get in the tournament, and this is the reality of college. Why people love college basketball. You get into the tournament, if you keep going to Final Fours and winning championships, nobody cares. Nobody talks about how bad Gonzaga's conference is anymore. You know what I mean? Because they've just keep doing it, and I think that's at the end of the day what the Bengals will have to do. They're just going to have to keep winning in the playoffs, and eventually 2 years, 3 years from now, there would be zero talk about them being having lucky runs, or having a lot, like their opponents having unlucky breaks or injuries. It won't be that. It'll just be, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. They're the Bengals and they would have beat you because they have Joe Burrow and the guys, right? So I think that's kind of how I rationalize it to myself. I also am, and like I said, I think one of the best solutions is to shut the laptop or close the app on the phone, go outside. What I was gonna kind of transition to, that's kind of what we're looking at in the media landscape, both from a social media and national media perspective. I think it's a new thing for the Bengals. I think it's the Bengals fans, the players and coaches, they aren't acting like it's a new thing. They're constantly telling us, no, this is what we were always going to be, and we all knew that and believed that. And I think educated fans knew that is going to come with some growing pains. Some growing pains from the fan base itself, but also a lot of I guess we're calling it hate, but I also would call it kind of readjustment of perspective from the rest of the NFL fan base to say, okay, when we talk about the best teams, or we talk about the best receiving core, best offense, or best all around team, we've got to talk about it'll be silly for us. It'd be obvious that we left them out if we don't put them in there, and that's where the Bengals are edging close to. And you say, well, they're one of the 2 best teams last year. That's got to stop. Playing in the Super Bowl does not mean you are one of the 2 best teams. That's never been what it meant. That means they were really good, and they did the things they needed to do to win the playoff games to get to the Super Bowl, right? You talk about 2 best teams, it's rare that the best team even wins the Super Bowl a lot of years, you know what I mean? Sometimes they get beat in the conference championship round, something fluky, you know what I mean? Or not even fluky, just another team was more prepared and beat them. It's a hard league, and I think what should the Bengals fans look forward to kind of in this season, but then just kind of going forward a little bit with the Joe Burrow era? How good do you think they get?
Yeah, I mean, for starters, all these agendas that they prop up now, and they're more prevalent and they're more creative just because the Bengals are more serious and they're better. Just look at the Patriots in general. I mean, for 20 years, they've won 6 Super Bowls, and the conversations and I guess the hating talk of it all, it just transitioned more to is it more Belichick or is it more Brady? But at the end of the day, does it really matter? They won 6 Super Bowl rings. It's arguably the greatest quarterback of all time. It's probably the greatest head coach of all time. It's there's only so much success that you can accept and still, kind of beyond these talking points, and they just have to kind of evolve, and they evolve the greater and more consistent that you can become. And then you look at, like you talked about with, how the players and the coaches kind of handled it all. And of course, they're always going to be like, yeah, this is what we expected from the jump. And you got some sense of realism from Burrow when he was on, I think, the Full Send podcast, when he's like, I didn't expect us to go to the Super Bowl after winning 4 games. But the coaches and players will always want to be ahead, at least from a public sense of like, yeah, this was always the plan. We put in the work for a reason. We instituted all these plans for a reason. It's to get to where we ended up going, and they will always want to be ahead of that because confidence attracts. And like you said, with like the 2015 team, that confidence never was there because they faltered for 4 years leading up to it. And even though they had the talent and everything going for them, I don't think they truly believed it in themselves because they couldn't quite prove it to themselves. Whereas this team, in one real year of Joe Burrow, they ended up going all the way, or at least almost all the way. And I think Cincinnati Bengals fans, they can't expect a Super Bowl run every single season, because that's just, even for the Tom Brady Patriots at their peak, they didn't always go every single year. There was like an 8-year drought or a 6-year drought between Super Bowl appearances, and I think a 10-year drought between Super Bowl victories. So winning consistently at the highest level is incredibly hard and difficult, especially now that you have everyone talking about how strong the AFC is. But the AFC is strong because of teams like the Bengals. It's not like the entire rest of the AFC got better than the Cincinnati Bengals team that went to the Super Bowl and also improved its roster. Like, the Bengals are a part of the upper echelon of AFC teams that make it such a devastating conference, and they belong. And I think that's what Cincinnati Bengals fans can take pride in. Like, the fact that this conference is so stacked and feared amongst the rest of the league, and the Bengals are at the top of that group, that top tier. They might not be right now as strong on paper as the Bills, and obviously the Chiefs will always be there, and you got the Chargers kind of ascending. But if the Bengals aren't first, they're definitely not far from first, and that's something that Bengals fans can take objective pride in, knowing that this team was pretty good last year and they've gotten even better this year.
Yeah, I think one kind of way to put it in perspective, the change in vibes that we've mentioned a couple times, how this team just feels different. I think I've thought about it quite a bit, and I think the main thing for me is, in the Marvin Lewis era, it always felt like they were trying to build a roster and a team and a play style to win the AFC North the old school way, like the early 2000s Ravens way with Trent Dilfer, and then even Ben Roethlisberger and the Steelers when he was like young, his first few years, he wasn't lighting it up. They were asking him to like hand the ball off and not turn it over. And I think that's what the Bengals were trying to do with Andy Dalton and that lot. They put together a top 5 defense at one point. They had this incredible offensive line and really good running backs and one stud wide receiver that could bail you out when you needed to. But they were building a team to make a run like the other teams in their division really had been doing it, right? But the league at the same time was changing, and it was becoming a passing offense dominated league, and they hadn't really built specifically on offense the kind of offense to exploit that with their coordinators and head coach. And then on defense, they just were kind of slow. They weren't fast enough they could get exposed by these super fast wide receiving cores that everyone else was building. Under Zach Taylor in this most recent iteration of this team, it feels like the opposite of that. They're actually building a team in a way that the rest of the league is emulating, right? Where in the ways that they're spending their money and making their draft picks and anticipating where the markets are going to go for like wide receivers. Like, they went and drafted stud wide receivers in like 3 consecutive drafts, and then all of a sudden, I think they foresaw like the wide receiver market. You're going to have superstars contracts coming up soon. They're going to set a new market for wide receivers. We're going to have our guys on rookie deals as long as we hit those picks, and that's a big part of it, is hitting the picks. But it just feels different in that regard. It felt like this was a team that was looking backwards to old school style football. Now it's a team that's looking forward to how the league is currently built to be able to win it.
Yeah, I think Burrow is the biggest part of that, and
you got to have the guy.
Them
right?
being, like them being bad enough to end up getting him. Like, I obviously I don't think being 2-14 was ever part of the plan, but it's just how those things kind of ended up. And I think the drafting of Chase was like the biggest signal of going away against the grain, like you were mentioning. Like, they could have just drafted Sewell, taken care of a big need there, and really bolstered up the offensive line to just protect him and improve the running game. But the drafting of Chase, knowing that you have a guy in T. Higgins who has the capability of being a number one. I think that was a big statement, and that's something that I noticed, and Nate Burleson noticed right after the draft. Like, they're not looking to necessarily compete in the AFC North primarily. Like, their goal is to compete with all these other elite offenses that they will eventually have to face in the playoffs and then in the Super Bowl. And that really accelerated the progress going forward. But I also think that it, for the most part, like, I feel like their values are still kind of there. Like, Joe Mixon's their highest paid running back in franchise history. They didn't pay him by accident. They still want to involve him more. Like, the fact that when we all thought that the offensive line was going to be the top priority in the 2021 offseason, then they spent even more, tens of millions of dollars on the defense to really, make that unit not just, a non-liability, but an actual asset and the strength. I think that's still, it kind of resembles what the Marvin Lewis era was. The defense is definitely more of an amoeba, and it's more, an evolutionary type concept compared to what Marvin Lewis's defense was when it was just 4-3, stop the run and didn't really change for the opponents. So some things have changed, but in essence, like, they still value the running game, they still value defense, they still recognize that the AFC North hasn't really changed, and there are certain ways that they have to combat it. But yeah, having the guy at quarterback and having like that guy at receiver and Chase, it really opens up the dynamic of the overall team.
Yeah, I think Lou Anarumo, I think, is actually trend setting more than Zach Taylor is from an offensive. Like, the Bengals defense is really unique in that they're really trying to form an identity around flexibility, essentially. Like they've got so many defensive backs that can play so many different spots. They don't have really anybody that you have to worry about, like, we can only play this guy in man schemes or only play this guy in zone schemes, because they're all versatile. You've got the defensive line is built the same way. You've got a big thumping linebacker in Jermaine Pratt, but you also have two really athletic coverage type linebackers in Akeem Davis-Gaither and Logan Wilson. All three of those guys, by the way, I think are going to have incredible seasons next year based on how I saw them play last year, and the success they had in the playoffs, just a huge confidence boost. But I mean, you start to see, like, because I watch schemes, I try to figure out pre-snap what the Bengals are lined up in, and it's almost never, by the time the play ends, my mind, I almost never identify it correctly. And I'm just a dude watching a game, but they rotate so well in the secondary, and they bring blitzes from places that, and it almost looks like that, like a variation on what the Steelers used to do when they had Troy Polamalu in that secondary, where you could bring mostly him, but they blitzed other people as well from just like different spots, and it's really hard to diagnose pre-snap. And I think that's become the, like, yes, you want your edge rushers. Edge rushers are always going to be super high value, especially if you get a dominant one. And you got to have the certain pieces. But the ability to stand one of your edge rushers up and play him at middle linebacker sometimes, which the Bengals do, just doing these kinds of things is, I think it's really interesting. But I'm going to have to leave it there. And John, really appreciate you coming on. And again, this is John Sheeran, John_Sheeran on Twitter. He writes for Cincy Jungle. He also is the co-host of the Bengals OBI podcast. Thanks again, John, for coming on.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, Mike. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys. Until next time, I've been Mike. He's been John. This has been Who Daily. See ya.